Uncle Tom. Well, that could be a derogatory slander, or it could also be a good thing if you're familiar with the book. Today, I'm bringing on Dallas Terrell, who's a personal trainer in Huntsville, who wrote a book. The book, Who Kidnapped Uncle Tom? We dive into the potential divine inspirations of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the impact it had on Dallas's life, and how he came to Alabama and his story. Coming up on 1819 News, the podcast.
We have an incredible culture here in the state of Alabama, but our politics and public policy don't reflect the people of Alabama. Media drives culture. Culture is what drives politics and public policy.
Welcome, everyone, to 1819 News, the podcast. I'm Bryan Dawson, CEO of 1819 News and host of this here podcast, where we're in pursuit of a free and flourishing Alabama every single week. Great episode for you today. Bringing on Dallas Terrell. He is the author of Who Kidnapped Uncle Tom? That book can be found wherever you buy books. And he's also a personal trainer in the Huntsville area, as you can probably see and hear. He's in his gym right now. So we're bringing him on. We're going to hear his story. We're going to hear about his book. But before we dive into that, I want to remind you guys that if you're not getting the newsletter, you are missing out. The 1819 News newsletter that comes out every morning, Monday through Saturday. We are driving the news cycle in the state. You go there, go to 1819news.com. At the top of the page, there's a button that says subscribe. Click that button. Give us your email address. We're not going to sell your data to anybody. We're just going to get you news. So go do that, and you will be all set to not be missing out. You may have some FOMO on all the things going on, but if you put in your email address there, no more FOMO for you. So that's good. All right, so... bringing on now, Dallas, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
So we've got a mutual friend who's been trying to get us together for a while, Stan McDonald, a dear friend of mine who's been very helpful to me with 1819 News. He speaks extremely highly of you, and glad we could finally connect, and really excited to hear about your story in your book.
Yes, I've known Stan for a long time. Matter of fact, I knew Stan back when he was starting his football team. So I saw your interview with Kyle, Coach Kyle Collins. So we go way back to that time.
Love it. Love it. Love it. Well, what I'd like to do, Dallas, if give me just like a punch of, Who Kidnapped Uncle Tom? I think that's a very catchy title. Give me like the 2-minute, bam, this is what it is. Then I want to hear your story, and then we'll finish with a longer conversation about your book. How's that sound?
Okay, that's good. Well, the name of the book is Who Kidnapped Uncle Tom and Why It Matters. I've been a lifelong fan of the Tom Cabin. I grew up in St. Louis with a mother who was into conservative politics in a very liberal city. And when I was growing up, I would hear people call her and her friends all kind of bad names. They would write things on her political signs that were in the front yard. And I would just ask my mom, what's up with this Uncle Tom thing? And she said, it's just ignorance, don't worry about it. And then they started using other words. And I was like, man, that's very disrespectful. So she brought me a little booklet that kind of explained who Harriet Beecher Stowe was, who Uncle Tom was. And then I was very perplexed because Uncle Tom was a Christ-like figure. So at age 12, my wheels started turning, and I'm wondering, well, how did that happen? Number one, and why did it happen? So that just kind of floated around my head for a long time. Kind of forgot about it. I kind of felt like, okay, I'm smarter than these adults because I know Uncle Tom was a good dude. It's obvious they haven't read the book. So I was satisfied with that. As I got older, I came into politics interests during the Reagan years. I'm 62 years old. I was a senior in high school. Ronald Reagan brought a lot of individuals who were not typical conservatives into, well, I would say out of the closet. And I began to hear those things again when that happened, because you had many blacks on television who were now proclaiming that they were Republicans. So all the name calling went up again. So at that point, I went ahead and got a regular copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin and read it. The other thing I read was kind of a synopsis. And I read the whole thing when I was in high school. And I was very intrigued. And at that particular point, I was on a crusade to just set people straight. That every time I heard that name or any kind of what I call a plantation-based or plantation era insults given because people disagree with something on politicals. I wanted to set them straight on that.
Amen.
So that's how I kind of came to this. And then of course when so that's kind of the beginning. There was another uplift when Clarence Thomas was being questioned and being nominated and being brought to the bar to be a Supreme Court justice. He called what was happening to him a high-tech lynching.
Yep.
And the fact that his name was Thomas, of course, that kind of went off the rails at that particular point about him being Uncle Tom.
Yeah. Man, well, this is exciting. I'm excited to dive into this, and I mean, it sounds like this book and your life are interwoven anyway. Because I want to be like, well, let's see. Like, I want to hear your life story, and then I want to hear about the book, and it really sounds like this book is an outworking of your journey, and so I think that's really cool. So you were born in St. Louis.
Yes.
Talk about that. How you got to Alabama. How you got to be a personal trainer in Huntsville. Just kind of give me, and I'd love to hear your testimony, and then we'll finish up talking all about the book.
Well, born in St. Louis, 1963, March of 1963. My mother was widowed when I was 3 years old. My father died in a car accident. So I'm an only child, although I was raised around a lot of cousins and everything, but I'm an only child. And I used to wear my mother out with asking her why stuff all the time. And one of the things that she would do to fuel that, she would give me something to read. So when it came to the human body, I was very intrigued with the human body. And I would ask questions like, how does the heart know to keep beating when we're asleep? And what makes the kidneys work when we're asleep? So I would ask her all these different physical questions like that. And back then, everybody had what's called an Encyclopedia Britannica, which was a big volumes of like 15 to 20 books that would take up a large bookcase on a large wall that many people had. And usually you had to buy one letter every summer because you couldn't afford to buy the whole thing at one time.
Yeah.
So I remember with the A's, it was the anatomy book. So I would look at the anatomy and I was just so enthralled with the different transparencies that you could pull back and see different layers of the human body. So that kind of fueled my desire to learn about physical things. Being an only child and growing up, I was playing sports, so I was into working out. So I was very intrigued with how the muscles worked. So I would look into the bones and the nerves and the muscles and see how they were attached. And as I grew up, I thought, man, this is pretty cool. I want to be someone who teaches other people how to exercise.
Wow.
Of course, back then, when we would ask our coaches why we're doing stuff, it usually meant you're going to get 10 more push-ups. You couldn't ask that kind of stuff. But I always felt like when I was younger that if I ever become a coach, I'm going to anticipate my students asking a question, and I'm going to ask it for them. I'm going to look at them and say, why are we doing this exercise? Or why are we doing it this way? So being able to understand the human body from that standpoint, I didn't want to be a doctor. I didn't want to be a physical therapist. But of course, back in the 80s, the idea of being a personal trainer wasn't really something that was viable unless you worked out movie stars in California or you were in New York working with show people who were on stage, or you were in Florida with the retirement community that was playing golf.
Yeah.
So I embarked on wanting to be a personal training before there was really something called personal trainers. Fortunately for me, once I was starting to get out of college, which was in '85, people started talking about something called the internet. So basically what you begin to have is that you begin to have normal exercise gyms starting to have to actually hire people that knew what they were talking about. Prior to that, you just had to look like you worked out and they would hire you. But because of the internet, they started needing people who looked the part, but also who could articulate to their members what the heck this machine does or what this muscle does. And someone who could communicate with doctors and physical therapists so that when they send their patients to this particular gym, I could speak their language somewhat and be able to interpret what this person needed to do now that they were released from physical therapy. So that, me being a why person, kind of helped that. It fueled my desire to read. So that gave me a very strong desire to want to read stuff. Books were my friends, so to speak.
Yeah.
So that all kind of came to place, all in this kind of the same area.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I assume your theological and political journeys might have had something to do with asking why and reading too.
Exactly, because I grew up, I grew up, my family was very church-oriented there in St. Louis. I remember that colliding with what I was learning in science. I remember coming home in elementary school, and I was upset because we had a very, what I would call now a militant science teacher who always insulted Christians in the Bible. And one day I came home and I asked my grandmother, she goes, "What's wrong with you?" I says, "Well, my science teacher keeps wanting me to be able to put on my work that we came from monkeys." And I said, "I don't believe we came from monkeys." And she said, "Well, I want you to go back to that school and ask that science teacher the following question. If we came from monkeys, why are there still monkeys?" And I thought, no, that's pretty smart.
Yeah.
So I went back to school, and I was probably 6th grade. So I went back to school and asked my teacher that question, and he stopped ridiculing people or Christians in class, at least the class I was in, because now he had someone in the classroom who was actually going to call him on some of the stuff that he was saying. So the idea of, natural selection and evolution and all those particular things, they came, in conflict with what I was learning in church. And then the thing that intrigued me about Uncle Tom's Cabin is when I heard that it was a bestseller and it had sold more copies than any book except the Bible, I thought, now I'm very intrigued. So I would want to wonder, okay, what is it about this book? Is there a spiritual element? So as I got older and I read about in her biography and her saying that one of the reasons was when she wrote the book, two things happened. One, she saw a picture, or what she would call an epiphany, of Christ when she was having communion at church. And the picture was a black male slave when she heard the minister say, "This is my body, which is broken for you." And there in 1852, the question of slavery was a very big deal. And she lived in an area there in Cincinnati, which is right across the river from Kentucky, where they had slavery. So she came in contact with lots of individuals who had experienced slavery and had conversations with them, individuals who were crossing the Ohio River trying to get to the north. So she was very in tune with that whole concept. Her family was very involved in abolitionist activity. So Harriet Beecher Stowe, when she saw that, and then later on when she's writing, she says, "I didn't write this book, God wrote it." So that intrigued me, that there's a spiritual element here. And that's when I felt like I had to write something. Because when I began to understand that people were they were trying to devalue Uncle Tom, and I began to feel that, okay, this is a spiritual battle. This just isn't politics. There's something deeper going on. Because the interesting thing is that you have very pro-white supremacist individuals in the 1850s who were against Uncle Tom. And then you had individuals who were very pro-black in the 1900s who were very, very anti-Uncle Tom. So I began to look at that and think there has to be a spiritual element, because now I'm thinking about Pilate and Herod, when they're thinking about the two of them, or Pilate and Caiaphas, who were very antagonistic toward each other. What Scripture says, and that day they became friends, and it was because of their equal hate for Christ. So that was the second part of my title. First, it was Who Kidnapped Uncle Tom, which basically deals with the 19th century. And then the second part, and Why It Matters, deals with the 20th century and beyond.
Okay. I'm interested too, just kind of on the personal front before we dive into the book anymore, and I definitely want to dive into the book some more. What was it like? I had a guy came on, his name is Pastor John Amanchukwu, who is working with Turning Point, a friend, and hearing his story, obviously he's in my generation, he's more, I think, closer to my age, but hearing about his father-in-law and how his father-in-law was able to minister him, disciple him into conservative politics, but also into his theological presuppositions and all of that. How did you become a conservative? I mean, just speaking very frankly, in your generation, a black conservative is even more rare than it is. Now there's more and more and more. How did you come to conservative, conclusions and thoughts? And then also theologically, sounds like you're a little bit more reformed based off some of the things I was reading that you sent me. How did that happen?
Well, one of the easy ways it happened is that I lived in a very liberal town run by liberals since the 1960s, and the city itself is basically almost not livable. So growing up around that, I understood that liberal policies were not the utopia that individuals would talk about. We were sold on the idea that if you had a black mayor, if you had a black police chief, fire chief, council people, that everything would be great for people that looked like that. And what my experience was right there in St. Louis, and as I began older, I began to also see it in other quote-unquote blue cities, that was the best antidote for me to be conservative, even if my mother wasn't conservative. But my mother was conservative. I recall one time when there were some people coming around canvassing, trying to get people to sign up so they could get on welfare. And these were just college kids. They really didn't know any better. So they would come and ask questions, and my mother was talking to them. And so they kept telling us, "Ma'am, you're a widow. You're raising a boy by yourself. You live in this particular zip code. You really check all the boxes. Can we sign you up for welfare or aid?" And my mother says, "I've got a pretty good job. I've got help from my other people in the family. I really don't need this. Go ahead and give that to someone else." And the girl just kept pushing her and pushing her. And then finally the girl said something to her, and my mother must have turned into the Incredible Hulk. But the woman said, "Why don't you do this for your people?" And I guess a fuse was lit at that particular point, because my mother gave her a sermon. I felt sorry for the girl because she couldn't have been no more than 19. She was just reading off a card, I'm sure. But when my mother, she kind of gave her the riot act about this idea of taking something from the government, even though you don't need it, and that being entitled because you check these boxes of being whatever the category is that's going to make you be able to get all these particular things from the government. So my mother, she wasn't anti-welfare or anything. She was basically telling them, "I don't need it. I'm doing okay. Give that to someone else." So growing up hearing stuff like that kind of gave me the up and up on, I didn't understand liberal conservatism, all that kind of stuff, but I did know that St. Louis was run by Democrats, and Democrats were running St. Louis into the ground.
There you go. Did you have any theological, religious, kind of spiritual mentors in your journey?
Yeah, I would say, really the adults in my family. My grandfather, although I didn't know him, he died before I was born, but he was one of the ministers of the church where my mother grew up in. And growing up, people always say, "You remind me of your grandpa. You remind me of your grandpa." So I would ask questions about him, his life, what he was about. So although I did not know him, I kind of respected him and kind of felt like he was a good guy, and I wanted to be more like him. Like I said, my father died when I was 3, and my mother never remarried, but I had lots of men in my neighborhood and around my church who would take, young boys in and accept them like they're their own children. So I had lots of godly influences around me. I got involved with Fellowship of Christian Athletes when I was in high school. Matter of fact, we started a chapter my junior year because we had a coach who ended up having cancer, and he kind of had a spiritual experience and wanted to bring Fellowship of Christian Athletes to our school. Because I was kind of one of the spiritual leaders on the team, he was asking me and a couple other guys, would we be kind of headed up? So that allowed me to kind of bring my spiritual training into my sports. I could pretty much take Jesus everywhere, but I kind of felt like I couldn't take them on the football field. I said, okay, Jesus, you sit over here and you be safe over here on the football field. We're going to go over here and wreck mate here. But as I got older, I met some guys who played for the St. Louis Football Cardinals who were involved with Fellowship of Christian Athletes in the professional ranks. And I would hear their testimony, and I would hear guys really raise my awareness that Jesus was not this effeminate guy with pretty long hair that was always looking shampooed, that you see on pictures and that you see in books. They talked about, okay, the man was a carpenter, and this was during a time when there was no power tools. So he had to be very strong. He had to have very strong hands, working with his hands. So my whole picture of Jesus kind of changed at that particular point. And I thought, and I played linebacker and fullback, and I thought, I think Jesus, if he played football, he'd be a linebacker or a fullback, because that's the toughest positions on the field.
Yeah, that's good. That is good. So how did you get to Alabama from St. Louis?
Well, as soon as I got out of college, of course, I worked in the fitness business. And there in St. Louis, I met a guy whose family had moved here after he went away to college. They had a business with defensive contractors, and they had done very well, and they was about to sell their business. So they called him and said, hey, we've been offered a bunch of money for our business. We're going to move to Florida. Come get your money. So he came back here to Huntsville, and there was a particular club that was going out of business. So he felt like he went to buy a gym. So he gave me a call and said, this was in '88, gave me a call and said, hey, I'm about to own a gym. I'd like for you to come down here to Alabama and help me run it. At the time, I was just getting married. I was looking to get away from crime, snow, and traffic. So when I visited Huntsville, of course, Huntsville was really small at that particular point, but I liked the idea that it was a military town and that there were lots of people who lived here who weren't from here.
Yeah.
So whatever typical thing that a northerner would hear about the state of Alabama, every typical bad thing you'd hear, that didn't seem to be the case in Huntsville, because about every third person I met, they weren't from here.
Yeah.
So the idea of doing what I did in St. Louis, in Huntsville, it wasn't a big deal yet. Personal training wasn't a big deal yet, unless you were a bodybuilder or a big-time lifting. But knowing that all these people were moving here from bigger cities, I kind of felt like, okay, there's probably going to be a market for that there. So I was all for moving there, and I really loved the fact that, if I went to go to a city, I could go a few miles north and be in Nashville, a few hours east and be in Atlanta, a few hours south and be in Birmingham. So my idea is that if I wanted to go to a city, I don't have to drive very far, but man, I don't have to live in the thing.
Yeah.
So that's what kind of moved back in March of 1989 to move here, to be involved in the fitness business. And then when I moved here, you could have counted. I mean, if they had a Republican executive meeting, we could have had it at Hardee's in a booth.
Yeah.
Because there were many individuals who were conservative Democrats here in Huntsville who were more conservative than Republicans were from Missouri.
Yeah.
So the Republican Party itself wasn't really something that was a big deal back there in the late 1980s, at least here in Huntsville it wasn't. And then once Bill Clinton had his second term and he started going more left, you started having more individual Southern Democrats saying, okay, Bill, I can't follow you there. You're starting to sound more like your wife Hillary than you did your first thing. So then I started to see these different individuals switch parties. And once I started seeing that, then I kind of felt a little more comfortable. But, Huntsville was a very conservative town anyway, even though, quote unquote, I wasn't involved in politics. But because of the business and the fact that you had government money here with business, so if you were a bigot, it behooved you to keep it under the rug because your money could get pulled, your contracts could get pulled if people knew about it. Wow.
Interesting. Okay. Well, that is I never stopped to think, because now Huntsville is, technically the metro area is the biggest direct metro area, though Birmingham's obviously still bigger than Huntsville, but Huntsville's huge now. It's exploded in that time. But that's an interesting history.
What's neat about it. I was able to move here right on the cusp of that happening. So I've been able to see and be a part of a lot of things growing. The conservative movement, Republicans, my business that I'm involved in, seeing it grow as far as other people coming into the business. So it's been kind of exciting being able to see all that.
Yeah. There you go. I just assumed you played Auburn football because you were friends with Stan and you are a personal trainer, but I guess I assumed wrong.
Because I'm from Missouri and I played for Southeast Missouri State University, which was a Division II school back then. But I was 2 inches too short, about 10 pounds too light to play for the big boys.
There you go. If you're running a ministry or you own a business, my guess is that you've been thinking about starting a podcast for a while now, but for various reasons it hasn't happened yet. Send me an email. I need to personally connect you with Yonder Child Media. They built this studio in 2 days and tackle all of the production. I just come in, start talking, and leave. It's that easy. They do everything else. Whether you want to record at your business or a home office like they just built for me, you come in, start talking, and Yonder Child will do everything else. Send me an email. That's going to be Bryan, Brian.Dawson, Dawson, at 1819news.com, and I'd be happy to personally connect you. I want to talk more about your book now. You bring up Clarence Thomas. My son and I, we started our book routine where we sit on the front porch. He's 15 now. We started when he was 14. And we read books, a couple chapters every Sunday after church. We sit and read books. And the first book that we read was My Grandfather's Son by Clarence Thomas. And it's basically his, it's his life story. And it's an incredible story. And and it was really interesting. We saw what they did to Clarence Thomas, but now basically any judge who's actually going to have anything that resembles a conservative worldview and how they approach, being a judge, whatever, they're getting that Clarence Thomas treatment. But Clarence Thomas was the first. Well, I guess Bork was the first, but Clarence Thomas is what was much, it was horrible. I mean, you can go back and watch those clips, and to see what he went through was unbelievable.
I remember seeing all that on television, so that made a big impression upon me. Because my idea was that these individuals that were calling him names, they had initials behind their names, so they were supposed to be very smart people.
Yeah.
And I thought, why are they insulting themselves by saying those particular things when they should know better?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, you look at some of these, these great judges that we were promised, whether it's Gorsuch, whether it was Kavanaugh, whether it's Amy Coney Barrett, whatever. Clarence Thomas is the greatest, may go down as the greatest Supreme Court justice in the history of our nation. It'll be between him and, it's not Alito. Who's the Scalia? Between him and Scalia, in my opinion. He's amazing. And time after time, we were covering this transgender ban that he wrote the ruling on. That was a Tennessee. Anyway, I'm not getting into the details of it either way. But he was the one that wrote the opinion, and you just see the stuff that he writes, the things that he does is, anyway, I'm rambling on, but what a blessing he's been for our nation in a time when we needed someone as anchored and rooted as he is.
Well, from a historical aspect, the thing I thought about back then was here was someone who was going to be the second black Supreme Court justice after Thurgood Marshall. And I thought that should be something that people should celebrate, even though they may vote differently, because Thurgood Marshall was a big deal.
Yeah.
And very involved in civil rights activity before he became a Supreme Court. So he had that background early on of representing people who were in very bad situations because their civil rights were being violated. And reading his story, I mean, he was in some very tough situations. One was right up here in Springfield, Tennessee, when a riot occurred up there. So, and I thought, well, here it is. It's going to be the second black Supreme Court justice, and individuals are going against him who look like him. again, that was one of those things where I thought there has to be a spiritual element here, because on the surface, it does not make sense.
Yeah, 100%. We'll talk about that, and they obviously hurled the slander at him, Uncle Tom, Uncle Tom. Talk about, I thought the way you teed that up was really interesting. So you had, the way that white people would derogatorily use the term Uncle Tom and the way that black people would derogatorily use the term Uncle Tom, and that's really bizarre. Talk about that some more.
Well, again, like I said, I begin, when I read that about Harry Beecher Stowe, and that you said, I didn't write this book. All I did was dictate it. God wrote it. And then the second thing was she was talking about how during communion, she united her character that she saw with Christ. So when you read Uncle Tom's Cabin, that's basically who Uncle Tom is. It's almost like he is a missionary that's been sent south in order to save souls. Because the things that he says, the comments he makes are straight up things that Jesus said when he was being condemned and when he was being maligned and said bad things about him. When he loved people, even though they were spitting on him. So when I saw that spiritual element in there, that's when I felt like I had to write, because when Donald Trump won the first time, I thought, okay, every Republican candidate for president since I've been involved in knowing something about politics, which was back to Reagan, every one of them at some point was named a racist. And I thought, okay, I know who Donald Trump was before he became a politician. And I knew about rap stars who were talking about him and movie stars who were talking about him and how he owned a football team and how he could be seen with Al Sharpton and NAACP people. And I thought, this is going to be interesting. How are they going to turn him into a racist? And by gum, they did it. So at that particular point, that was 2016. So at that particular point, I thought, man, if this happened in 2016, 2020 is going to be off the chain. So that's when I started writing. It was in February of 2017. And my idea was that I wanted the book to come out in 2020, leading up to the 20 election. But we all know what happened in 2020 when the world shut down.
Yeah.
So at that particular point, I said, okay, God, you knew 220 was going to happen back in 2017. So there's a reason why I can't get this book out right now. And again, what I began to see what that reason was, there was a lot more material out there that I was going to get. Yeah. Because Trump, like Reagan, brought a lot of non-traditional independents into the Republican Party.
Yeah.
So once I begin to see that, and I begin to see during the 1900s, some of the things that the Marxists were doing in order to foment chaos and division, and I begin to understand, again, it wasn't called critical race theory that I knew of back in 2015, 2016. All I knew was that Marxism uses individuals who may have legitimate reasons to have gripes, and they use that in order to bring division.
Yep.
So I lived that and I saw that, and I thought there has to be an element here that after all these years, people are still referring to individuals who don't think like them on political issues, calling them an Uncle Tom, or calling them a coon, or calling them a house nigga, or a porch monkey. And I thought, these are terms that people who were trying to devalue a whole ethnic group. And why would individuals of the same ethnic group turn around and use those same terms on individuals who look like them?
Yeah.
So that's when I figured this is a spiritual issue. So I just kept digging and digging, and I just began to uncover some things, and I felt like, man, I've got to write. So going all the way back to the idea of evolution, eugenics, things that were going on in neighborhoods where, because of the Industrial Revolution and the Marxists trying to get a hold of means of production by being very involved in organizing unions, and Americans at that particular point, especially Black Americans, really not knowing the essence of what real Marxism was about. All they knew was that the Republican Party was being quiet when they should have stood up. The church was being quiet when it should have been more vocal. And that Jim Crow and the Democrats were running wild. So at that particular point, you had individuals that felt like, what's the next thing? So the next thing was socialism. But they only was taught about a certain aspect of socialism. And then the next thing that rolled in was the theology. What's it called, Brian?
Well, there's the liberation theology.
Liberation, yeah.
Yep.
Then became liberation theology.
Yep.
So I began to read stuff about the civil rights movement and liberation theology, and begin to see different aspects that just kind of followed a pattern down through the years. And, they say the idea is that if you don't learn from history, you'll repeat it. Mm-hmm. And I just saw that happening within the black community. And then I also saw where you had white conservatives who wanted to say something, but they were afraid to say something because they were going to be labeled as racist. And I thought, I want to write something that's going to give individuals who want to speak truth, give them a paradigm where they can speak truth and not fall into this idea of being called a racist. Because what I tell them is this: there's only one race, and that's the human race. So if you are someone who ascribes to the Bible and someone calls you a racist, ask them what race are they talking about, the animal race or the human race? Because individuals who ascribe to natural selection and evolution, that is the very definition of racism.
Yeah.
Because the idea of multiple races within the human race came out of the idea of natural selection, because you need a stair step from the primate to the human, to the higher human. And I begin to understand that the individuals who are going to be the closest to the primate looked a lot different from the individuals who were at the top of the ladder.
Yeah.
And that if individuals who call themselves scientists or call themselves evolutionists, when I would call them on that, they didn't have anything to say, because they could not get around it. I would look at them and says, look, I know you're a good person. I know you're a nice person, but do you realize your theory is the very definition of races, because there was no such thing as multiple human races prior to this talk coming out of the Enlightenment period, when they were trying to find a reason to, or an explanation for life without the divine hand involved. And then, of course, understanding the book of Romans, where it says, and when they reject God, they had to come up with a lie and begin to believe and begin to worship the creature instead of the creator.
Yep.
So the idea being is that once you start coming up with a human reason for our existence, that lie has to get bigger and bigger and bigger, because it gets further and further away from the truth. So, Brian, all these things just started coming together. The race, quote unquote, the race issue, and how it's used, how it's been used in the past, how it's used now. I saw a common thread. You're going to like this, Brian. The common thread was pride. The middle letter in pride and the middle letter of sin is I. And the idea of individuals raising themselves to a place where they are above God and above God's word was the original lie in the garden. It was the thing that got Lucifer kicked out of heaven, was that he says, I'm going to rise up and I'm going to be like the Most High. So the idea of I is what the bigots in the 1800s had in common with the pro-black individuals in the 1900s. It's all about power. It's all about controlling power. So you begin to see that during the movement of the agricultural population moving to the Northeast during the second industrial revolution here in the United States, where you had distinct groups of people moving into distinct areas of cities that were very ethnic oriented. So say in New York, you had your Italian Hill, you had your Scottish, you had your Irish, you had your Germans, and then you had, in Harlem, you had your blacks. So during that particular time, for the most part, that was pretty benign, because people wanted to be among their own. But what began to happen is that once you begin to see the Southern blacks leaving the South and moving to the North, the Northern blacks talked down upon them and looked down upon them because they felt like they were holding stuff back. So as I began to study this and see these particular things happen, they started calling these Southern blacks who did not have the benefit of education the way some of these Northern blacks did. And you also begin to see the Caribbean and West Indies group who had moved to the Northeast after Britain and some of the other countries had ended slavery in the Caribbean. You had many of those blacks and those mixed blacks moving to the Northeast. So by the 1860s, 1870s, after the Civil War, you had 2 generations of West Indies heritage blacks living in the Northeast. And those individuals did not identify with the blacks who were born in the United States because they came from a totally different culture.
Yeah.
So those blacks were called pseudo-blacks because they talked with an accent. Religiously speaking, they were more Anglican and English church. They weren't Baptist. They weren't Pentecostal. So they did not feel at home in the quote-unquote black church that was starting to grow in the Northeast during the early 1900s. So you had these groups of blacks. You had the Northern blacks who had the benefit of education. You had the second and third generation of West Indies blacks who did not identify with them, but they were very political minded, and they were the group that the Marxists would target in order to get them to organize the other blacks. So you look at some of the early quote-unquote political leaders and the movements like Marcus Garvey, some of those guys, they all had West Indies backgrounds. And they were not as tied to America as Americans were. So they were willing to buy the idea of conflating the black struggle with the struggle with what was going on in Asia and South America. But that was a pretty hard sell to be able to tell black folks here in the United States that your brothers in Asia are suffering, because they're like, well, we're suffering too. What do I care about folks in Asia?
Yeah.
The folks in Asia, they live in Asia. I live here. We have a constitution, and I'm seeing people who come to this country from another country, and they get moved ahead of the line than we do, and we were born here. So you had those 3 groups. Those 3 groups could not get along for the most part because it was a pride thing. Who was going to be the group that had the black identity? So you had the Harlem Renaissance. You had the movement away from the traditional leaders who came out of the Civil War who were very theologically motivated. Your Booker T. Washingtons, your Harriet Tubmans, your Frederick Douglasses. Those individuals were dying off in the early 1900s. And then you had a new group coming up, and that would have been your Marcus Garveys. That would have been your individuals who were more militant. And then you had the hero at that particular point was not the Uncle Tom character, but the Nat Turner character.
Okay.
And that was playing off a lot of the riots and the revolution that you saw 50, 60 years earlier in the Caribbean when you had the Great Haitian Rebellion, and you had some other things that went on in those particular areas. But slavery had a whole different feel to it in those particular areas because the slaves made up the majority of the population of many of those areas where plantations were. The whites that were basically there were individuals who were managing the plantation. They didn't own the property. They didn't have any stake. They were just managers.
Yeah.
So when it came to unrest in those particular things, you did not have an indigenous white population to come in and put it down.
Yeah.
So when you figure you have that kind of background of individuals who move to the United States after slavery ends, they're kind of built a little different because they don't have the baggage that some of the blacks from the South had, and they don't have some of the hang-ups that some of the blacks from the North were having because of Jim Crow that was going on in the North. You still had separate water fountains, bathrooms in the North, even though they were free states. So this whole thing of not being able to get together And Brian, so what I've been beginning to see was this. You know, when you have a two-party system, and it's important if you are a minority group, whenever you consider yourself a minority, that you've got to have people in key areas in both parties, because somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. However, if you've got a large swath of your individuals who are following one party, and that party does not have to compete for that vote, they're not going to do anything once they get in office for you.
Yeah.
And then if the other party wins, the other party's going to say, well, they don't welcome us anyway, so we're not going to do anything.
Yep.
Every time we go in there, they question our motives. Anytime that we put forth a candidate that looks like them, they call them names. So in that vein, the black community of the United States is screwed.
Yeah.
And that's what shows up throughout the years when it comes to the blue cities.
Yeah.
So what I try to tell individuals is that, and this is the same thing with Christians, is that you need Bible-believing Christians in both parties in order to pull both parties back more toward not being extreme in certain areas where pride and power becomes the motivating factor for being in office, but that individuals have a servant heart. And the example of Uncle Tom's, I call it's a servant-style leadership. And that's the kind of individual that we need to be attracting in public office, regardless of what color the people are. Because when we begin to understand all of the corruption and the misuse of funds, it's because we end up drawing people into public service who are crooks to begin with.
Yeah.
Because honest people who want to get into it, they get riled and talked about and called all kind of names. And that particular person just says, well, man, I'm going to go back to the private life and, be concerned about my little community and my family and my church. And they kind of go into a kind of a closet, so to speak.
Yeah.
So what do you have is that you have what we have in this country right now.
A bunch of crooks running the government.
And the problem is that it's not that they're crooks, but they keep getting voted in.
Yeah. No, it's crazy, and it's an interesting thing that I'm glad you brought up the Christian thing because, I've always said Christians are to the Republican Party what blacks are to the Democrat Party. The Democrats come out and promise the blacks the world and then never deliver, knowing that they're always going to have that vote. And then come election time for Republicans, they pander to Christians and then they don't do anything for them. It's very similar. Let me ask you this. We've got a few minutes left. I find it interesting that Uncle Tom's Cabin was the bestseller, I believe it said, of the 19th century. And then a couple centuries before, I think they're very competitive on most bought books after the Bible was Pilgrim's Progress.
Yes.
And if you read that story, it's obviously, I think John Bunyan was like in a prison cell when he wrote that, and it seemed to have a spiritual element. For a book to be that widespread, that read, it seems like there has like a divine inspiration. Talk a little bit more about the divine inspiration in Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, because when you look at, there's this expression I remember hearing growing up, when God starts blessing, the devil starts messing. So when you look at a particular, like Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and even some of the other, like I said, individuals who were involved in abolition, but came from a more Christian background, those individuals will kind of get pushed to the side when it comes to what's considered black history. I remember growing up that W.E.B. Du Bois was made a big deal, and they made fun of Booker T. Washington. And when I began to understand where that kind of came from, and begin to understand that W.E.B. Du Bois, pretty much declared himself an atheist, he got rid of his American citizenship and moved to a dictatorship in Africa. And here it was Booker T. Washington, who suffered much. I mean, W.E.B. Du Bois wasn't a slave, and he grew up around in a very affluent area. Not that I'm not saying he didn't experience any racism or ethnic ignorance, I would call it. But when it came to who was going to represent black uplift, it became passé to turn these two leaders against each other, where instead of saying, look, we need doctors, lawyers, architects, but we also need bricklayers, we need house builders, we need plumbers, we need people who can grow food. For some reason, they had to turn into an either or thing. It was, you're going to be with W.D. Du Bois or you're going to be with Booker T. Washington. And I thought that does not serve the community well. It does not serve the country well. So again, the spiritual element came up, was that these are individuals that you had to remove the spiritual element from the black struggle in order for Marxism to have more of a hold in who was going to be the leadership. So you just begin to see that through the centuries, through the years, coming all the way up from the early 1900s. Only the names changed, but the issues were still the same. Things that we think that were new, they're not new, they're just named something else. BLM was something else in the 1920s. It was something else in the 1940s. All these things are. So, I really set out in writing this book, Who Kidnapped Uncle Tom and Why It Matters, with the idea is that I want to bring people to an area where you can have conversations and that you can honor individuals who have servant-minded mentalities when it came to betterment of the community, and be able to point out those individuals who are building up themselves to the detriment of the very people whom they say they represent. So I wanted to have a hashtag wanted to start was conversations that matter. And that is individuals who look different, who may come from different classes, different part of the country, can have difficult conversations and not use history as a weapon, but understand in the context when things happen and not be able to try to interpret them from the context that you're now in. Because I would hear all the time, well, if I was Uncle Tom, I would have ran away. Well, Herod Beecher Stowe had a certain purpose for Uncle Tom. Just like on the cross, if you be the Christ, come down from the cross. No, he could not come down to the cross. Peter said, Christ, you will not suffer. Peter did not want to see a crucified Savior. He did not want to see a suffering Savior. But Jesus always reminded him, I must go through this in order to bring salvation. Uncle Tom had to go through what he went through in order to bring salvation to other individuals. So while the world is playing checkers, Herod Beecher Stowe was playing chess because she had a divine hand on that pen when she was writing.
That's incredible. Well, Dallas, that is great. Tell us, real quick plug, where can people find your book or where they can find you?
Well, the thing that came out from this book, and I talked about, when it didn't come out in 2020, it came out in 2025, was that, I started off with a plate and God gave me a platform. There's actually 3 more books that have come out of this. This is stuff that really got kicked out of the book because my book was getting too long. So another book that has come out for this is called Meditations from the Cabin. And they are devotions that I have picked, certain things that happened in Uncle Tom's Cabin, to go as a primer where people were reading Uncle Tom's Cabin and think about things that are devotional and meditation and in order to help people build up their Christian life when it deals with dealing with stuff that you don't understand. So you go through that particular book. It's called Meditations from the Cabin. That's a smaller book. It's a devotional book. There may be individuals may say, this thing about who kidnapped Uncle, there's too much history in that for me. Well, it's not really written to read from the front and back. When people look at the table of contents, they may see a particular area in there that's more interesting to them than another area. So skipping around and reading Who Kidnapped Uncle Tom and Why It Matters is a little less intimidating for an individual to go through. And then in Meditations, of course, it's a smaller book, so it's 40 devotionals. 2 other books that will come out in the fall. I won't even talk about those right now, but on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, there's a couple other online things that I'm really not familiar with right now. But if you go Google Who Kidnapped Uncle Tom or Google my name, Dallas C. Terrell, Terrell, it'll come up. So that's what I want. My goal is to not make people Republicans or make people Democratic. It's to get people to have conversations So they recognize that when we play plantation politics, when we allow ourselves to go keep fighting while those who are in elected officials are doing things that we don't recognize because we're too busy fighting each other, and we don't hold them accountable, that it doesn't matter what kind of sign you have in your yard, you are screwed, we are screwed. And that's basically what I've seen happening here in the United States, that we have to wake up, we have to be able to have conversations that matter, where it doesn't devolve into calling each other names, and then leave the door open for more conversations. But at the end of the line, I've got to be able to walk across my lawn, talk to the guy who lives next door and say, hey, we've got 4 problems on the street. You and I need to get together and address these problems with some of our other neighbors. That's when things start getting done. The answer is not in Montgomery. The answer is not in D.C. The answer is not with your city council. The answer is right there on your street with your neighbors who need to get together so that when they call their elected officials, those elected officials know, man, I just got called from Democrats, I get called from Republicans, I even get called from independents. And they're all saying the same thing. Come fix such and such. I think I need to get on the stick.
Yeah, that's good. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dallas. Really appreciate it. I think this is great. You guys go check out his book, buy his book, wherever books are found. Yeah, that'll wrap it up. Thank you, Dallas.
You betcha.
Awesome, guys. Well, wraps it up for this week. Until next time, as always, put your trust in God and keep your powder dry.